A mother sold her pregnant daughter. A widowed rancher gave her shelter. She was 8 months pregnant when her mother chained her wrists and dragged her through the dirt, not toward help, but toward a deal. The kind of deal where human lives came cheap, where dignity was an afterthought, and where no one expected the girl to make it past the winter. No words of goodbye, no hint of shame, just the rattle of iron, the sting of betrayal, and the knowledge that the woman who should have protected her had chosen a bottle and a bag of coins instead. And standing there in the shade of the old feed store was the man who would buy her. Not with hunger in his eyes, not even with pity, just silence. His name was Samuel Byrne, and he didn't flinch when he was told the girl might not survive childbirth. He only asked one question: can she ride? The answer didn't matter. The trade was made. 2 silver coins, a jug of whiskey, and a note scribbled on the back of a receipt. Half a steer come fall. That was her price. That was her worth. If you've ever believed that the people we least expect can carry the greatest stories, if you've ever felt broken, abandoned, or traded away like you didn't matter, then stay with us. Because this isn't just about survival. It's about what happens when silence becomes sanctuary, and when a cry in the dark becomes the first note of something brand new. You're watching Cracks of Light, where untamed love, loss, and redemption unfold in the roughest corners of forgotten lands. Subscribe, tap the bell, and join us. Some stories aren't loud, but they echo forever. It was nearing sundown when they left town. Lena didn't look back. The cuffs had been removed, but the bruises on her wrists were fresh, the sting still climbing up her arms like heat. Her throat ached from holding in every scream she hadn't let out. Samuel didn't speak. He walked ahead, his horse already saddled. The trail leading out of town was narrow and dry, flanked by pine shadows that looked like they were waiting to swallow her whole. She rode behind him, shifting in the saddle every few minutes from the pain of the weight she carried. The baby inside her shifted too, quiet for now, but present, like a secret neither of them had asked for. The ride was long, the silence between them longer. Lena had grown up around loud men, drunk, angry, slamming doors and shattering bottles. Samuel was none of that. He didn't look at her. He didn't touch her. And somehow, that unsettled her more. When they arrived at the homestead, the place looked like it had been waiting for ghosts, not people. The boards on the porch were worn and gray. The house was small but didn't creak when she stepped inside. It was clean. That surprised her. No smell of whiskey. No moldy bread on the table. Just smoke from the hearth and a strange calm that made her skin itch. "This room," Samuel said quietly, motioning toward the left. "Water's by the stove. Bed's firm. I don't come in without knocking." Then he left her standing there. Lena didn't thank him, didn't ask questions. She walked into the room slowly, like entering a trap she couldn't see. The quilt on the bed was too fine for a place like this. Beside the dresser was a brush, a mirror, and a pair of unused women's shoes. That's when she realized someone had lived here before her. Someone who didn't make it. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hand instinctively reaching for the inside of her boot. The blade was still there, thin and sharp, sewn in tight. She didn't trust him. Why would she? That night, she didn't sleep. The baby kicked once, twice, then went still. Outside, coyotes howled like a warning. Inside, Lena stayed curled up under the quilt, hand gripped around the knife. Every creak, every pop from the fire made her heart jump. She counted her breaths. She told herself if he came in, she'd stab him. Not in the chest, in the thigh, just enough to run. But he never came. And by dawn, when she finally drifted off, the only thing sharper than her blade was the question ringing in her head. What kind of man buys a girl and never asks anything of her? Lena didn't ask questions when she was shown the room, and Samuel didn't offer answers. The place was too quiet, not in a peaceful way, but in the way of things that hadn't been spoken aloud in years. There were no voices, no music, not even the idle hum of someone talking to themselves while cooking. Samuel moved through the house like a shadow with purpose, deliberate, silent, never lingering longer than needed. Each morning, Lena awoke to find cornbread or eggs or something else warm on the table, left without explanation. He never waited around to see if she'd eat. He just left it there like it was his obligation, not kindness. He didn't ask how she was sleeping or if the baby was giving her trouble. He didn't speak at all unless it was necessary, and even then, it was clipped, factual, never more than needed. She didn't know whether that made things better or worse. The room he gave her didn't feel like a prison, but it didn't feel like home either. The bed was too neat. The mirror too clean. There was a pair of shoes by the dresser that had never been worn, and a small stack of neatly folded dresses, none of them hers. She didn't touch them. She barely looked at them. They made her feel like a stand-in for someone else. Each night, she lay awake listening to the wind press against the walls, one hand resting on her belly, the other curled tight around the hilt of the knife she kept tucked in her boot. She'd sewn it in herself, 3 towns ago, when it became clear her mother's debts were worth more than her life. Every sound made her flinch. Every creak could have been footsteps. But they never came. Samuel didn't try to enter her room. He didn't stare at her. He didn't speak to her in the dark. He didn't touch her. Not once. During the day, she watched him from behind curtains or the corner of a doorway. He spent hours in the shed behind the house, fixing tools or oiling leather. He carved handles, rethreaded reins, repaired fences that didn't seem broken. Always working. Always quiet. When she crossed paths with him, he nodded, sometimes mumbled a word or two. She nodded back. That was it. No suspicion, no aggression, just the strange absence of everything she expected. No man had ever given her space before. It made her feel less safe, not more, because she didn't know what it meant. On the 6th morning, she found firewood stacked neatly outside her door, a clean wool blanket folded on top. It wasn't cold enough for either. Still, he left it. That same day, she opened the drawer of the dresser for the first time and found a hairbrush with long strands still caught in the bristles. Blonde. Not hers. She closed it again. That night, she didn't sleep much. Not because of fear this time, but because something had shifted. Something small. It wasn't comfort. But it wasn't dread, either. The silence was changing. When he did speak, it was never about her. He mentioned weather, a broken hinge, that the goats needed watching. He never asked why she cried at night. Never asked where the bruises on her arm had come from. Maybe he already knew. Maybe he didn't want to know. Or maybe he understood what it meant to carry things alone. Whatever it was, Lena began to notice that her knife sat untouched more nights than not. She still checked the window. Still memorized which floorboards creaked. Still had a route planned if she had to run. But her hand didn't tremble when she poured water anymore. Her shoulders didn't flinch at every movement. The man who had bought her was not a man like the others. He never asked her for anything, and in a strange, quiet way that made her feel even more exposed. Because if he didn't want her for her body, or for what she could do, then what was she doing here? And what was he hiding behind all that silence? It was nearly midnight when Lena woke to the sound of something that didn't belong. A muffled sob, soft but sharp, like it had broken loose after years of silence. She pushed back the blanket, moving carefully, listening. The fire had gone low. The house was still except for that single sound, barely more than breath. She stepped into the hall barefoot, the floor cold under her soles, and followed it. The door to the front room was cracked open. Inside, Samuel sat by the window, the lamplight dull and flickering. He didn't see her. His eyes were fixed on something in his lap. A dress, pink, small, barely larger than his hands. It was hand-stitched, delicate in a way that didn't match the man holding it. He touched it like it could fall apart, like it already had. She watched as his mouth moved, barely forming words, like he was speaking to someone who wasn't there. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there, invisible, not sure if he was praying, or remembering, or maybe both. The next morning, neither of them spoke about it. But the silence had changed. It wasn't distance anymore, it was weight. That evening, Lena asked him how long he'd lived here. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, long enough to forget what it's like to wait for something. She didn't press. She didn't need to. She knew the look in his eyes. The kind of grief that doesn't speak unless it has no choice. So she waited. That night, as rain fell outside and the wind pushed against the shutters, she came back to the fire where he sat carving a piece of wood. She sat across from him and, after a long pause, began to speak. My mother used to say I had pretty eyes, Lena said. Said they'd be worth something if I learned to smile more. She ran the bar at the mine town. Cheap whiskey, cheaper rooms upstairs. When I turned 15, she started making me pour drinks. When I turned 16, she told me to sit on laps. When I said no, she didn't yell. She just locked me in the goat shed for 2 nights. After that, I smiled. I poured. I did what she wanted. Her voice didn't shake, but her fingers twisted in her lap. Samuel didn't interrupt. I got out once. Ran to Dry Creek, scrubbed sheets at a boarding house. That's where I met him. Thought he was different. He was for a while. Until he wasn't. By the time I found out I was pregnant, he was long gone. My mother said no one would take me like this. Then she found out someone would, for a price. She looked at Samuel directly now. And here I am. He set down the carving knife slowly. She made that dress after the third, he said, voice low. Still believed it'd be different next time. She lost 7. First one early. Second one didn't breathe. The fourth was a girl. Made it 2 days. He stopped. We didn't name any of them. We just buried them behind the ridge. One marker for each. He looked down at his hands, scarred and steady. The last one, she made the dress too early. It sat on the dresser for weeks. When she passed, I couldn't throw it away. Lena didn't speak. She didn't have to. Everything was already in the room with them. The ghosts, the silence, the weight of too many things that had no names. You ever think about leaving? She asked. Samuel shook his head. There's nowhere I want to go. This place, it's not kind, but it's mine. Then after a long pause, he said, I didn't buy you to save you. I bought you because I didn't believe in anything else. Lena looked at the fire. And I didn't come here hoping for kindness. I just didn't want to sleep in the dirt anymore. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The fire cracked. The rain thinned. Something between them, something old and unnamed, settled for the first time. Not peace, not forgiveness, but recognition. 2 people who didn't ask for what they'd been given. 2 people still carrying what they couldn't let go. That night, Lena didn't reach for the knife. She didn't sleep easy, but she slept. And when she dreamed, it wasn't of hands grabbing her, or boots kicking down doors, or the smell of whiskey-soaked breath. She dreamed of the pink dress, small and still, and of a grave with no name, and of the wind passing through trees that didn't judge, only listened. The air changed before the fire came. It was the kind of stillness that made animals run and the sky hang low, heavy with something unnamed. Lena had packed what little she owned, her shawl, the knife, a tin cup, the baby clothes folded tight in a scarf. She didn't leave out of hate. She left because staying had begun to feel like suffocating in a silence too deep to swim through. But she didn't make it far. Just past the barn, she stopped. The smell hit first, smoke, sharp and bitter, rising from the tree lean like a warning shot. Then the wind turned, fast and erratic, carrying with it the first flickers of flame from Briar Ridge. Fire in this land didn't ask permission. It devoured, and it was coming fast. Samuel burst from the shed, face pale, eyes locked on the red line crawling toward them. We go now, he said, already moving. Lena tried to run, but her legs buckled. Pain struck without mercy, low and deep and final. Samuel, she gasped, one hand pressed against her belly, the other clawing at the fence. It's starting. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He soaked 2 wool blankets in the trough, wrapped one around her, the other around his shoulders, then lifted her like a man lifts what he refuses to let go. The flames were close now, close enough to taste in the back of the throat, close enough to light the sky like day. He didn't head toward town. He turned west, through the gully, down the narrow path almost hidden by overgrowth. Lena had only heard of it once, in a passing word. The old stone hut. It had been used long ago, when his wife was still alive. A place of birth and once death. Now maybe both. The trail twisted and narrowed, brush catching on clothes, smoke clawing at their lungs. Lena writhed in his arms, her whole body clenched, sweat pouring from her despite the cold rush of terror. I can't, she gasped. You can't, he snapped. Just hold on. She didn't respond. She buried her face in his chest and screamed as the next wave of pain hit. By the time they reached the hut, the sky was orange-black, and the air roared with sound. Samuel kicked open the wooden door and laid her on the straw-covered floor. Inside was dark, cool, stone-thick. It muffled the world just enough to breathe. He moved quickly, lighting the small oil lamp, placing buckets of water within reach, laying out blankets. Lena was soaked, shaking, barely able to speak. The contractions came in waves, ruthless and relentless. She screamed through the first, bit down on her knuckles through the second. By the third, her voice was hoarse and raw. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, Samuel said, kneeling beside her. But you're not alone. Hours passed like decades. He held her hand through every push, every cry. He didn't flinch. Not when she cursed, not when she sobbed, not when she begged for it to end. He wiped her brow, whispered simple words. You're strong. You've made it this far. Just a little more. Outside, the fire thundered. Inside, another kind of storm raged. Until finally, it broke. One last scream, followed by silence. Then a sound that shattered the weight of the world. A baby's cry, sharp, alive, demanding. Lena collapsed, chest heaving, arms limp. Samuel lifted the tiny, blood-slicked form, wrapped it in cloth, and held her up to the light. A girl, pink-faced, furious, breathing. He placed her in Lena's arms gently, reverently. Lena cried. Laughter and grief tangled in her throat. Rose, she whispered. Her name is Rose. Samuel sat beside her, back against the wall, body shaking not from fear, but something deeper. He looked at the child like she was a thing he never thought he'd see again. Then he nodded. Just once. That's a good name, he said. The wind outside howled. The fire had moved on. But inside that hut, something had started. Not just life, but something that looked like it might stay. Lena pressed her lips to her daughter's head, her hands trembling, her body broken and whole all at once. And when the baby cried again, loud and strong, it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like defiance. Like beginning. Like hope finally had a name. Samuel had barely spoken since the birth. He'd stayed close to Lena, watching her with the kind of attention that didn't ask questions but didn't miss anything either. He held Rose for only a moment, then handed her back like she was something too delicate to trust himself with. He moved slowly, his face drained, his hands streaked with soot and blood, but he didn't complain. He just sank down beside the wall, leaned back, and closed his eyes. Lena didn't notice at first. She was still locked in the weight of what had just happened, her arms curled around the baby, her skin cold but her chest full of heat. Rose let out a soft hiccup and then stilled against her chest. Lena looked down at her, at the impossibility of it. She hadn't believed she'd survive this. She hadn't believed the baby would. And yet, here they were. When she turned to speak to Samuel, he didn't move. His body was slumped to one side, head tilted awkwardly, his lips parted just slightly. Samuel, she said. No response. She leaned forward, wincing as pain lit up every muscle in her lower back, and reached for his shoulder. Hey. Still nothing. Her hand gripped his arm and shook it once. Then again, harder. Samuel, come on. Rose whimpered quietly, sensing the change. Lena pressed the baby tighter to her chest and crawled over the straw-covered floor toward him. She pressed her ear to his chest, holding her breath so she could hear his. There was a sound, but it was faint, like something trapped at the bottom of a well. No, she whispered, shaking his arm again. Don't do this. You don't get to do this now. Her voice cracked, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. You carried me through fire. You don't die in the quiet. Her forehead pressed against his shoulder, her tears warm against his collarbone. Please, she whispered. Please don't leave. Not now. Not when she's here. And then Rose cried. It wasn't a soft cry. It was loud, sharp, full of fury. It cut the air like a blade. And somehow, it cut through him too. Samuel's body jerked once, then again. He gasped, a sound raw and uneven, and his chest lifted under Lena's hand. His eyes blinked open, unfocused, then found her face. She's got lungs, he rasped. Lena laughed and sobbed at the same time, clutching him with one hand and Rose with the other. So do you, she said, voice shaking. You're not done yet. He didn't respond, but the corners of his mouth twitched, something between a grimace and a smile. His hand rose slowly, touched the edge of the baby's blanket. He looked at her like she was something sacred, something he never thought he'd see again. They stayed like that for a long time, huddled together in the stillness after fire. The air in the hut was thick with smoke and damp straw, but they didn't move. There was no need to. Nothing mattered except that all three of them were breathing. When Samuel finally slept, it was shallow and uneven, but real. Lena didn't sleep at all. She watched Rose, counting every breath. She stared at the man who had carried her through flame without asking why. And she listened, not for danger, but for the silence that had finally changed. It wasn't hollow anymore. It held something now, something like a beginning. By morning, the smoke outside had thinned. The fire had passed, leaving behind blackened trees and scorched grass. Lena stood just outside the doorway, holding Rose to her chest, her shawl pulled tight. The wind was cool, carrying the faint smell of ash, but it wasn't angry. It was tired. The world had burned, and now it was quiet. Not empty, just waiting. Behind her, Samuel stirred. He didn't say anything when she stepped back inside. He just looked at her, then at the baby, then nodded. That was enough. He stood, slowly, carefully, every movement deliberate. Together, they packed what little they had. Blankets, a few jars of water, what was left of the food. Samuel took one last look at the place, then closed the door behind them. They didn't talk much on the walk back. The land was gray and brittle, but it wasn't dead. Not entirely. A few stubborn green shoots had survived along the edge of the creek. Smoke still rose in thin spirals from the hills. The fence around the homestead had collapsed in places, and the barn bore deep scorch marks. But the house still stood. The porch, the windows, the roof. It was all there, covered in soot, but untouched by flame. Lena stopped at the steps. Rose tucked into her chest and let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Samuel reached past her, opened the door, and motioned her in. Inside, everything smelled like smoke and lemon oil. He moved slowly, clearing space on the table, then pulled out the kettle and set it on the stove like he'd done every morning before the world caught fire. Lena sat, rocked the baby gently, and watched him move, more tired than before, but steadier too, like something had settled in him. Rose stirred and let out another tiny cry. Samuel paused, turned, and looked at her. She's strong, Lena said softly. He nodded. So are you. Lena didn't answer. She didn't need to. They both knew the truth now. They'd survived the fire. And more than that, they'd found something inside it neither of them expected. Not safety, not comfort, but life. Real and loud and demanding. And in that moment, it was enough. 1 year later, the house didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It echoed. With footsteps, with laughter, with a baby's shriek when she fell down and got back up, again and again. Rose was walking now, barefoot, wobbly, stubborn, and her giggles filled spaces that had once held only silence. The roses along the fence had bloomed. Not perfectly, not in neat rows, but they bloomed. Soft pink and pale white. They pushed through the soil Samuel had once believed too thin, too dry. The same bulbs his wife had planted long ago and watched wither year after year. But now, under new hands, under new breath, they had taken hold. Not because the land had changed, but because something inside the house had. Samuel stood on the porch most mornings, carving spoons or mending harnesses, eyes drifting to Rose toddling in the yard. Sometimes she tripped. Sometimes she cried. But mostly she moved like she belonged there, like the land had never burned, like it had always been hers. Inside, Lena stirred stew over the stove, the smell of onions and thyme soaking into the walls that no longer seemed cold. Her belly was round again, the curve of new life quiet and undeniable beneath her apron. She didn't talk about the second pregnancy much, but when Samuel looked at her and rested his hand gently over the small of her back, she didn't flinch. She let it stay. The neighbors who once whispered behind curtains had started leaving things. At first, it was just bread. Then jars of peach jam, hand-stitched socks, small quilts folded with care. One basket came with a note, scribbled in a child's handwriting. Sorry for what my mama said. They didn't knock. They didn't expect thanks. They just left what they could. And over time, the porch became a place where people lingered. Old men with cracked boots and coffee-stained hats. Women with pie tins and gossip softened by time. No one brought up the fire. No one asked about the past. They just showed up. And Lena let them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned thick with heat, Lena stood at the edge of the garden, watching Rose chase a butterfly. Samuel came up behind her, wiping his hands on a rag, and rested his palm against her lower back. She called you Bay this morning, Lena said, smiling. Before she said Mama. Samuel raised a brow. I counted, she added. He laughed, a deep, honest sound that had become more familiar than strange. She's clever, he said. She's yours, Lena replied, her voice quieter now. Samuel didn't correct her. He just looked at Rose, running through the tall grass with a flower in one hand and dirt on her knees. Ours, he said. They didn't talk much about the fire anymore, or about the child Samuel had once buried behind the ridge, or the wife who'd planted roses that never grew. Those things didn't vanish. They just didn't rule the room. The past had a place, but it didn't decide the future. Not anymore. That fall, Lena helped Samuel dig new rows beside the fence. He turned the earth with care, his hands still calloused, his shoulders broader somehow under the weight of purpose. She planted new bulbs, more roses, wild ones. They might not take, he said. Maybe not, she answered, pressing the soil down gently. But maybe they will. He nodded, the same way he had when she named their daughter. Quiet, unsure, but willing to believe. By the first frost, the house had changed. It still creaked. The roof still leaked. But now it held breath. It held noise. Rose's crib sat near the window where the morning sun touched her face, and Samuel had carved her name into the edge with a steady hand. Lena read aloud in the evenings, one hand on her belly, her voice soft and even as the fire crackled. Samuel whittled nearby, the shape of a toy horse taking form in his fingers. When she paused, he looked up and said, "Joy comes in the morning." She smiled. "You finally believe that?" He didn't answer. He just leaned in and kissed her forehead. The land hadn't forgiven everything. Some trees were still blackened. The air still smelled like ash when it rained. But the garden grew. Rose grew. Love, when built from ruin, holds different weight. It doesn't ask to be perfect. It just asks to stay. And when Lena stood on the porch, hand resting on the life inside her, watching her daughter run with a rose in her fist and dirt on her cheeks, she knew she wasn't surviving anymore. She was home. If you've ever felt discarded, forgotten, like the weight of your past was too heavy to carry another day, then this story was for you. If you've been told you were too broken to begin again, too late to be chosen, too complicated to be loved, then hear this. Sometimes life doesn't bloom in the right season. Sometimes it comes after fire, after ash, after everything you thought would save you has already walked away. But survival isn't the end of your story. It's just the pause before something begins. Samuel Byrne was a man who believed hope had died with the last child he buried. Lena Walsh was a girl sold off like she was nothing, carrying a child no one asked for. Neither of them planned on healing. Neither of them asked to be seen. But in the silence between them, something grew. In the middle of loss, life took root. Not easily, not perfectly, but it did. Rose's first cry didn't just announce her arrival. It pulled a man back from the edge. It reminded a woman that her worth was never measured by what she survived. It proved that even in the loneliest places, something sacred can still rise. So if you're watching this and wondering if your life can turn around, it can. If you're carrying pain that feels like it's going to crush you, know this: pain can be a seed. And even in the hardest ground, even after the fire, something beautiful can grow. Not in spite of what you've been through, but because of it. And if this story stirred something in you, if you felt seen, even for a moment, we invite you to stay with us. This is Cracks of Light, where forgotten souls find their way back, where love doesn't always come easy, but always comes real. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and most of all, hit that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss the next story that might just light up the dark. You're not alone. Not here. Not anymore.